A black man is pulled over by police for no apparent reason. Tension rises, words are exchanged, and hands edge toward holsters until he calmly reaches into his jacket and hands them his FBI badge. What happens next will not only shift the mood, but spark a conversation that challenges everything they thought they knew. This isn't just a story about power and prejudice. It's about dignity, courage, and the quiet strength to change hearts. Before we dive into this true-to-life story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below, and if this story touches you, don't hesitate to share your thoughts. Now, let's begin. The streets were quiet that evening, the kind of calm that only seems to settle after a long workday when the world exhales into the twilight. Michael Lawson sat behind the wheel of his black sedan, his fingers resting gently on the leather of the steering wheel as a soft jazz melody played through the speakers. The saxophone's smooth notes mingled with the low hum of tires on asphalt, creating a rhythm as familiar and comforting as an old friend's voice. He was tired but satisfied, the kind of fatigue that came from work well done, from hours spent in meetings and on the phone, piecing together a federal investigation that had been dragging for months. The sun had dipped low behind the Georgia pines, casting golden shadows across the suburban landscape, and Michael allowed himself to enjoy the rare moment of peace as he drove through a quiet neighborhood lined with neat lawns, porch swings, and flagpoles. The kind of neighborhood where people waved when you passed by. The kind of neighborhood where a man like him was still met with cautious eyes. He adjusted his rearview mirror and caught a glimpse of his own reflection. Sharp suit, pressed shirt, clean-shaven with a fade cut just last Saturday. Everything about him screamed professionalism, respectability, order. But none of that would matter in just a few minutes. Because respectability, he knew, wasn't armor. Not in America. Not for a black man. The first flash of red and blue lights appeared behind him with no siren. Just a sudden brightness that startled him out of his reverie. He blinked, checked his speedometer, 41 in a 45. No rolling stops. No erratic lane changes. He hadn't done a thing wrong. Yet the lights stayed on, and as he signaled and pulled to the curb, another patrol car slid up from the opposite direction and parked at an angle in front of him, effectively boxing him in. The music in his car played on, unaware of the shift in atmosphere. Michael reached forward and turned the volume down, his hands steady even as his chest tightened. He exhaled, long and slow, and placed both hands deliberately on the wheel, fingers spread. Every movement was intentional, rehearsed, the way his father had taught him when he was 16 years old and eager to take the family sedan out for the first time. "If you ever get stopped, son," his father had said, "you act like your life depends on staying still. Because sometimes it does." Michael had learned to follow rules that weren't written in any DMV handbook, lessons passed down through generations like heirlooms. Keep your voice calm. Don't reach for anything without saying so. Smile if you can, but not too much. He saw the first officer approaching in the side mirror. White young, maybe early 30s with a buzz cut and tight shoulders. The second officer moved along the passenger side, eyes scanning the interior of Michael's vehicle like it was a scene from a crime show. The first cop didn't smile. He didn't introduce himself. He simply said, "License and registration." No explanation. No greeting. Just authority pressed through clenched teeth. Michael offered a small nod and said, "Of course, officer. May I ask why I'm being stopped?" The officer's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't answer. Michael moved slowly, narrating his every action. "My wallet is in my inside jacket pocket. I'm reaching for it now." The officer didn't object, but he watched intently, his hand never straying far from the holster at his hip. Michael handed over his ID and registration with the care of a man holding something far more fragile than paper. The officer glanced at them, then passed them to his partner without a word. "Is this your vehicle?" the first cop asked, still not making eye contact. "Yes," Michael replied evenly. "Registered under my name. You'll find that information matches the title." There was no reaction, just suspicion, thick in the air like humidity before a storm. The second cop peered into the back seat, shining his flashlight even though the summer sun hadn't fully set. Michael's calm never broke, but inside, a slow burn began to kindle. He'd lived through this before. not just in his own life, but through the stories of friends, uncles, classmates. Stories that always started with a simple stop and sometimes ended in something much worse. But tonight would not be one of those nights. Michael was sure of that, because in his left breast pocket, just above his heart, was something that could flip this entire situation upside down. Still, he waited. He didn't reach. He didn't correct them. He didn't resist. He simply sat, hands on the wheel, eyes forward, heart steady, and prepared for what would come next. Because when you've spent your life walking the line between perception and reality, between how the world sees you and who you really are, you learn the power of patience. You learn that the truth has its own kind of gravity. And when revealed at just the right moment, it can bring everything crashing down in silence. The second officer lingered near the back door, his flashlight slicing through the dusk as if searching for ghosts. Meanwhile, the first officer remained beside Michael's open window, glancing at the license and registration like they were puzzle pieces that didn't quite fit. There was no recognition in his eyes, no softening of posture, no indication that he'd realized the man sitting before him was not only a law-abiding citizen, but someone who'd sworn an oath to protect the very laws this officer was now distorting in practice. The silence between them grew taut, the kind of silence that says more than words ever could. Michael didn't speak again. He knew better. He'd learned, over years of disciplined training and lived experience, that silence could be a shield, too. Still, even shields grow heavy when suspicion thickens like storm clouds, and the longer the officers lingered without offering a reason, the more apparent it became that this stop was rooted not in law but in presumption. The officer shifted his stance, finally breaking the silence. "You from around here?" he asked, tone clipped and cold. Michael's response came steady, deliberate. "I live 20 minutes from here, in Decatur." "What brings you to this neighborhood?" came the follow-up, sharp and quick. "Work," Michael replied simply. He didn't elaborate. He didn't say he'd spent the last 8 hours inside a secure federal facility, combing through case files and intelligence briefings. He didn't mention that he'd left behind a stack of reports to get home in time for his daughter's bedtime story. Because none of that mattered. To them, he was still just a black man behind the wheel of a nice car in a nice neighborhood. That was his crime. That was all it took. The younger officer, still scanning the back seat, called out, "Got anything in the vehicle we should know about? Weapons? Drugs?" The question, posed casually, landed like a slap. Michael turned slightly toward the voice, resisting the instinct to frown, to question, to rise. Instead, he answered with calm precision, "No, sir. There are no weapons or illegal substances in my vehicle." The flashlight beam lingered on a small leather briefcase on the passenger seat. "What's in the case?" "Work documents," Michael answered. "Sensitive files. I prefer not to open it outside this environment." That caught the officer's attention. He stepped forward. "Sensitive how?" Michael finally allowed himself a breath. He knew that line of questioning could tip this entire exchange in one of two directions. He could play it safe, appease their curiosity, placate their misplaced authority. Or he could speak with the authority he actually possessed. Before he could choose, the first officer at the window took a more aggressive tone. "Sir, we're going to ask you to step out of the vehicle." Michael hesitated only for a second, not out of defiance, but calculation. Every movement mattered. Every gesture was a test. He nodded. "I'd like to comply, but I need to reach for my seatbelt first. Is that all right?" The officer gave a curt nod. Michael moved slowly, unbuckled the belt, and then gently opened the door. As he stood, the second officer moved in behind him, one hand resting ominously on his own belt near the holster. "Face the car, hands on the roof." The words landed hard, even though he had heard them before, on television, in training, in whispered stories told by uncles at cookouts. But hearing them now, from behind, in his own suit, after a day of service to the very government that had trained these men, it was a bitter twist. Michael complied, fingers spread on the warm metal of his sedan's roof. One officer began to pat him down while the other asked again, "Is this your car?" "Yes," Michael answered again. "Registered to me. Insurance current. No outstanding tickets." "And yet you're being evasive," the first officer said, almost with satisfaction. "Not evasive," Michael said. "I've answered all your questions. I simply haven't given you the response you expected." That gave the officer pause. His partner, less composed, muttered under his breath, "Smart guy." Michael heard it. He'd heard worse. But it wasn't the insult that struck him, it was the familiarity. The frequency with which intelligence in his skin was treated as insolence. That tension, the one between brilliance and threat, was the tightrope he walked daily. As the officers conferred in hushed tones, Michael stood still, the warm Georgia air pressing against his back. He knew his moment was coming. He'd given them every opportunity to correct their course, to recognize the man in front of them before it was too late. But now, as one of them reached again for the handcuffs, Michael spoke. "Before you go any further," he said with even clarity, "I strongly recommend you check my credentials." Inside my jacket pocket, left side. The hand on his arm froze. The officer hesitated. "What's in your pocket?" Michael turned his head slightly, just enough to make eye contact without being confrontational. "My identification. You're going to want to see it." There was a pause, a long, charged moment of silence, before the officer reached into the jacket pocket. What he pulled out wasn't a driver's license. It wasn't a concealed carry permit or a state ID. It was a leather badge holder embossed with the letters that made the air feel suddenly heavier. FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigation. The officer's face drained of color. The other one stepped back, as if the badge itself carried weight. Michael didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He simply watched them process what this meant. Watched them feel the shift in power. Watched them begin to realize what they had almost done. Because in that moment, they weren't just officers performing a stop. They were two men who had to answer to someone bigger than their uniforms. And that someone had just handed them his badge. For a moment, the world stood completely still. The badge sat in the officer's hand like it was radioactive, as though it had the power to burn away the assumptions they had carried into the stop like invisible armor. Michael said nothing. He had learned long ago that silence could speak louder than any words when delivered at the right moment. The officer glanced up at him, the stiffness in his jaw replaced with something more fragile. Uncertainty, maybe even fear. It was the look of a man trying to calculate just how badly he had misjudged the situation and wondering what consequences might now come to pass. His partner hovered behind him, fidgeting nervously, his confidence unraveling in real time. The power dynamic had reversed itself without a single shout, without a raised hand, without resistance. It was all there in that small leather badge holder and the calm poise of the man who owned it. "Is this real?" the officer asked, his voice lower now, almost cautious. "You can call it in," Michael replied evenly, his tone flat and unwavering. "Field office numbers on the back." The officer turned the badge over with trembling fingers, then handed it to his partner, who looked as though he might choke on his own breath. For a few seconds, they said nothing, just exchanged uncertain glances while the weight of what they'd done settled over them. Michael stood there, arms at his side, still not moving, still allowing them the space to recognize the truth for themselves. He wasn't about to make it easy. He wasn't about to reassure them. They had assumed he was a threat because of the color of his skin and the car he drove. And now, they were scrambling to rewrite the script they had written for him in their heads. The officer who had cuffed him earlier finally spoke, the words brittle and clumsy. "Look, we just got a report about a suspect in the area. You match the description." Michael turned to him, his expression unreadable. "And what description was that exactly?" "A black man in a dark car, wearing a suit." The officer didn't answer. He couldn't, because there was no real description, no detailed bolo, no legitimate cause for the stop. Just an assumption that a man like Michael didn't belong in a neighborhood like this, driving a car like that, carrying himself with that level of quiet authority. "We didn't mean any offense," the younger cop said, as if the offense was simply a misfired word or a joke gone too far. "It's just protocol." Michael's mouth twitched at the word. Protocol. The magic word officers always used when they didn't want to say profiling. "If this is your protocol," he said, his voice measured, "you may want to rethink your training, because your assumptions nearly led you to handcuff and search a federal agent without cause. That's not protocol." That's bias. The words were like stones dropped in still water, small but carrying deep ripples. The officers looked at each other, both standing straighter now, perhaps trying to regain the posture of authority, but the damage had already been done. Their badges no longer gave them the upper hand in this interaction. Their silence confirmed what Michael already knew. They were hoping the badge he'd shown them would make the problem go away, without them ever having to acknowledge what they'd just done. Michael could have escalated. He could have demanded their badge numbers, called his supervisor, made this moment into a scandal that would follow them for the rest of their careers. But instead, he simply waited. He had learned, long ago, that sometimes the most powerful thing a man could do in the face of injustice was to let the truth linger uncomfortably in the air and force others to sit with it. The officers finally began to backpedal, stumbling over their words. "We just want to make sure everything was in order," one said. No harm meant, but harm didn't require intent. Harm could be woven into the very fabric of a system. Harm could be inflicted with a polite tone and a forced smile. Michael knew that, and so did they, whether they admitted it or not. A neighbor across the street had come outside and was standing quietly on her porch, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold. Michael wondered what she thought. If she had assumed, too, that the black man pulled over was up to no good, or if she had known, just from his demeanor, that something deeper was playing out. He wondered how many times she'd seen something like this and looked the other way. Or maybe this was her first time seeing the script unravel, the suspicion collapse, the truth break through the cracks. Either way, Michael didn't acknowledge her. His focus remained on the two officers, both of whom now seemed smaller than they had just moments before. "I suggest you call in and verify my credentials," Michael said. "You've already wasted enough of my time." The older officer gave a nod, clumsily lifting his radio to make the call. As he turned away, Michael heard the static and the low murmur of his voice describing the badge, the name, the agency. The younger officer stood awkwardly, unsure where to place his hands now that his confidence had been stripped away. Michael stepped back toward his car, not to flee, not to withdraw, but to reassert what had never been taken, his dignity. He wasn't angry. Not yet. But the cold coil of disappointment wrapped around his spine like a snake, because deep down he had hoped, just once, that he wouldn't have to explain himself, that he could just be a man driving home. The sun had all but disappeared by the time the verification came through the officer's radio. Michael stood beside his car, his arms now crossed, not in defiance, but in quiet restraint, the kind of composure that doesn't demand attention but commands it nonetheless. The radio crackled with the dispatcher's voice confirming his status. Badge number verified. Michael Lawson, Special Agent, active, Atlanta Field Office. Clearance Level 3. Those words should have ended the interaction right then and there, should have triggered apologies, should have prompted a backward shuffle of shame. But instead, the officer holding the mic looked like someone who'd just discovered they'd been walking across a frozen lake with no idea how thin the ice was. The silence that followed wasn't just uncomfortable, it was revealing. Michael could see it in their eyes, especially the younger one, whose jaw clenched as if he were resisting the urge to lash out, not because of what Michael had done, but because of what Michael represented. A disruption, a contradiction, a challenge to the image they'd painted of him the moment they saw the shade of his skin through the windshield. And then, as if drawn by the strange gravity of authority reasserting itself, the older officer shifted back into the stance of control. "Sir," he said, clearing his throat, "we appreciate your cooperation, but we still need to do a brief check of your vehicle for our report." Michael's head turned slowly, his eyes narrowing not in aggression, but in incredulity. "After verifying I'm a federal agent, you still feel the need to search my vehicle? Under what grounds?" The officer hesitated. "It's standard procedure when we've initiated a stop." There was again procedure, the blanket word that covered all manner of sins. Michael had heard it so many times before it no longer sounded official. It sounded like an excuse crafted to make unjust actions palatable. He took a slow breath, drawing on every ounce of the training the Bureau had drilled into him over the years. "I do not consent to a search," he said firmly. Unless you have a warrant or probable cause, you know you can't proceed. The officer didn't argue. He didn't need to, because just then, the younger one took a step forward, voice raised just slightly above what the situation required. "We're doing our job," he snapped. "You're acting like you've got something to hide." Michael's jaw tightened, his patience beginning to fray at the edges. "The only thing I've hidden here is my disappointment," he said, voice low, almost like a whisper. "Disappointment that even with my credentials, even with the verification, even with the way I've handled myself, you still can't see me as anything other than a threat." The officer's face reddened. "Keep your hands where I can see them," he barked suddenly, hand brushing against his holster. The command sliced through the moment like a knife, and even though there had been no sudden movement, no aggression, no escalation, it was as if his fear had overtaken logic. Michael could feel the weight of unseen eyes watching from the surrounding homes, neighbors tucked behind curtains or standing in shadows, witnessing something they didn't fully understand but instinctively knew was wrong. Michael didn't argue. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his hands into the air. It was a pose so deeply etched into the American conscience, so historically loaded, that for a second it felt theatrical. But it wasn't theater. It was survival. And in that gesture, in those two hands held aloft under the dimming sky, was a message older than Michael himself. That in the eyes of power, surrender was still sometimes the price of survival, even when you wore a badge of your own. The younger officer seemed almost triumphant, as though that small act of compliance had restored the fragile authority he'd lost. But what he didn't understand was that Michael wasn't submitting. He was bearing witness, not just to them, but to everyone who might one day hear the story. Because this wasn't just about a stop gone wrong. It was about how far a man had to go to be seen for who he truly was. "You need to calm down," the officer said, although Michael hadn't raised his voice, hadn't moved, hadn't done a single thing that could be read as a threat. "You need to think carefully about what you're doing," Michael replied, hands still up, his eyes locked on the man's. "Because the only one escalating here is you." The older officer stepped in then, voice lower, tried to regain control of the moment. "That's enough," he said, more to his partner than to Michael. "Stand down." The younger one hesitated, then nodded reluctantly, his body still tense. Slowly, Michael lowered his arms, but the emotional residue remained. His shoulders felt heavier now, as if they bore not only his own weight, but the weight of generations before him. Men and women who had stood with their hands in the air, not in guilt, but in survival, not in surrender, but in resistance. "You've seen my ID," Michael said quietly. "You've heard my record. You've verified everything. And still, you treated me like a suspect." His words weren't angry. They were weary, honest. They floated in the night air with the slow finality of a bell tolling in the distance. The officers said nothing, not because they didn't have words, but because none of the words they had could erase what had already happened. Michael walked back to his car, his steps deliberate, controlled, proud. He slid into the driver's seat, closed the door with a soft click, and for a moment just sat there, hands resting once again on the wheel, the jazz still paused mid-note on the stereo, as if waiting for permission to resume. The flashing lights receded in the rearview mirror, but the memory, the indignity, the weight of being misjudged by those sworn to protect, that would linger far longer. As Michael sat in his car, the engine humming softly beneath him, he rested his hands on the steering wheel in the same exact place they'd been before the stop. But this time, the gesture wasn't about protocol or caution. It was about regaining stillness, reclaiming control over the moment. Outside, the two officers were still lingering, not saying much, not doing much, just hovering in that awkward space where authority had unraveled and silence now made them feel exposed. Michael didn't look at them. He didn't need to. He knew what they were doing. They were buying time, trying to figure out how to exit the situation without a scar, how to avoid the fallout that comes when an assumption is confronted with undeniable truth. The power dynamic had shifted the moment that badge had been pulled from his jacket, and they were no longer in control. They were managing damage. The badge itself had sat quietly in his pocket the whole time, pressed against his chest like a silent witness, a talisman he never wanted to need, but always carried, just in case. There was irony in that, he thought, that the very thing meant to symbolize trust and justice had become his shield against those sworn to uphold both. And now, as he reached over to finally turn the music off, his evening no longer suited for jazz. The younger officer knocked lightly on the window, his face less rigid than before, but not humbled, not really. Michael rolled the window down halfway, enough to speak, but not to invite. "Sir," the officer began, his voice flatter now, trying to sound calm. "We just wanted to make sure there wasn't any misunderstanding here." Michael's eyes didn't blink. "There wasn't," he said. "You assumed I was someone else because you couldn't imagine someone like me being who I am. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a belief system." The words hit the air with weight, and the officer stood there with nothing to say in return. The older one approached from behind, his face tight with forced professionalism. "We've completed the stop," he said. "You're free to go." Michael tilted his head slightly. "I was always free. You just didn't know it." He didn't raise his voice, didn't lean out the window, didn't gesture for emphasis. He simply let the truth hang there between them, like humidity, thick and unrelenting. The officer gave a half nod, maybe out of respect, maybe out of guilt, but Michael wasn't interested in decoding his expressions. He wasn't looking for closure. He was looking for accountability. He reached into the center console and retrieved the badge wallet once more, flipping it open so both men could see the gold emblem gleam onto the fading streetlight. "You know what this is," he said, voice calm but sharp. "But you still saw me as a problem first and a person second. You still chose to escalate before asking a single real question. That badge didn't stop you. It just embarrassed you." The younger officer looked away. The older one stiffened. Neither of them apologized. Michael didn't expect them to. He'd long since stopped waiting for apologies in moments like these. They never came when they should, and when they did, they were usually wrapped in excuses or policy jargon that erased the harm with technicalities. Michael closed the badge wallet slowly and placed it back in his jacket pocket. The gesture was deliberate, almost ceremonial. It reminded him of all the times he'd done the same thing in courtrooms, at crime scenes, in interviews where the badge opened doors and commanded respect. And yet here, in his own country, on a quiet suburban street, it had taken everything he had not to use it too soon. Because to reveal it early would have felt like begging for safety. But to reveal it late, like he had, made a statement. A line drawn in silence. The officers gave one final glance, then turned and walked back to their cruiser, heads low, shoulders heavier than when they had first stepped out. Michael watched them go through his side mirror. The red and blue lights flickered off at last, leaving only the soft orange glow of the street lamp and the hum of crickets returning to the night. He pulled away from the curb slowly, the road now clear but not free. As he drove, he thought about how many others had stood where he had, hands raised, voice steady, dignity intact, and still walked away carrying wounds no one could see. And he thought about how close he'd come to becoming just another statistic, a name read aloud in protest, a face printed on a t-shirt, a story told in sorrow instead of strength. That thought lingered longer than he wanted it to. But then he reminded himself, he was not a symbol. He was a man, a father, a protector, a federal agent. And this moment, however maddening, however unjust, would not define him. It would inform him, fuel him. As he turned onto the highway, headlights trailing like ribbons in the night, he reached into his pocket and touched the badge once more. Not to reassure himself, not to relive the confrontation, but to remind himself of the responsibility it carried. Because carrying that badge wasn't just about authority, it was about integrity. And now more than ever, he realized it wasn't enough to wear it. He had to live up to it. He had to be better than the men who stopped him. He had to show them what it really meant to protect and serve. And that began not with drawing lines between them, but with forcing those lines into the light and daring others to cross over to truth. The highway stretched before him like a ribbon of silence, dotted with headlights that blinked and passed like indifferent glances from strangers. Michael drove without the radio now, the cabin filled only with the low hum of tires on pavement and the thoughts spinning quietly in his head. The city lights faded behind him as trees rose on either side of the road like sentinels watching his passage. There was something sacred about that kind of stillness, a hush that didn't ask for permission, that just settled into the bones of the night. But tonight, it felt heavier. Tonight, the silence wasn't restful. It was full. Full of everything he hadn't said. Full of the weight he had carried through that roadside encounter. And all the encounters before it. The ones that never made the news, that never ended in violence, but still left a scar. Not the kind people saw. The kind that whispered late at night when everything else had gone quiet. He gripped the wheel a little tighter, more from habit than tension, as the memory of the officer's voice echoed in his mind. "Keep your hands where I can see them." That command, sharp and absolute, had followed him through boyhood, through college, through Quantico. It had followed him into rooms where he was the only black man in a suit, where he had to work twice as hard to earn half the benefit of the doubt. Even now, with a badge tucked into his jacket and a resume that could silence most doubters, it had followed him still. Because respectability didn't shield you. Success didn't change skin. And sometimes, even a gold badge couldn't compete with fear. He reached the off-ramp to his neighborhood and turned down the winding road that led to home, an old colonial with creaky floors and a wraparound porch, the kind of place that made people feel safe when they drove past. His daughter's bedroom light glowed softly on the second floor, the silhouette of her stuffed animals lined up like loyal sentries along the windowsill. He parked in the driveway and just sat there for a while, engine off, the heat slowly fading from the dashboard vents. The pause felt longer than it was the kind of pause that comes after holding your breath too long, when you're afraid that if you exhale, you might start to shake. He wasn't afraid of the officers. Not anymore. He was afraid of the way moments like this piled up inside him, stacking one on top of the other like bricks until they threatened to collapse. He closed his eyes and leaned back against the headrest, letting the weight of the evening roll over him again. The fear, the restraint, the clarity, the disappointment, they all lived together in the same place now. He thought of his father and the lessons he'd passed down. Lessons about how to stay alive, how to disarm fear without ever raising your voice. He thought of how many times those lessons had saved him. And then, with a twist that felt both ironic and cruel, he thought of how those same lessons would soon have to be passed down to his own child. Because that was the unspoken inheritance. How to survive being misunderstood, misjudged, mishandled. He finally stepped out of the car and walked toward the porch, the old wood groaning beneath his feet like it knew the weight he carried tonight was heavier than most days. He unlocked the door and stepped into the familiar scent of home. Clean linen, a hint of lavender, and something warm coming from the kitchen. The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual, its second hand jerking forward like a hesitant breath. From upstairs, he heard the soft rustle of sheets and the faintest creak of a bed frame. His daughter was still awake. That thought, simple as it was, brought a softness to his chest he hadn't felt in hours. He climbed the stairs slowly, each step a small return to himself. At the top, her door was cracked open just enough for the hallway light to spill inside. She lay curled beneath a sea of blankets, eyes wide and waiting, her favorite book resting on her chest. "I waited for you," she said sleepily. "You said you'd read the next chapter." Michael smiled gently and crossed the room, sitting on the edge of her bed. "I'm here now," he said, brushing a curl from her forehead. She held out the book with small hands, her trust complete and unquestioning. And for a while, there was nothing but the rhythm of his voice, the turning of pages, and the steady return of peace. But deep beneath the calm, the long pause still lingered. It was more than just a moment of reflection. It was a reckoning. With himself, with the world, with the painful truth that even after years of service and sacrifice, he still had to prove he belonged. That pause held 1,000 questions he couldn't yet answer. How many more times would this happen? What if next time, the badge wasn't enough? What if his child grew up and faced the same silence he carried now? Not because of anything she did, but simply because of who she was. He kissed his daughter goodnight, whispered that he loved her, and stepped back into the hallway. The pause followed him, but so did the strength. because every quiet moment, every breath he took after moments like tonight, was an act of resistance, an act of endurance. And though he would never seek out these encounters, he knew this truth. He would always face them with his head high, his badge in his pocket, and his heart wide open to the work still left to do. Morning light crept through the curtains like a gentle reminder that time, no matter how heavy the night before, kept moving. Michael stood at the kitchen counter, coffee in hand, watching the steam curl upward into the quiet. His daughter's laughter echoed faintly from upstairs as she got ready for school, and the clink of breakfast dishes from the dining room told him his wife was already moving through the morning routine like clockwork. Everything felt normal again, safe, domestic, warm, but normal was a thin veil. Beneath it, the previous night still echoed in the spaces no one could see. He sipped his coffee, let the heat settle in his chest, and found himself staring at the garage door like it might open on its own and pull him back into the memory of red and blue flashing lights, of raised voices and hands in the air. He didn't want to dwell, but he also couldn't pretend. Later, after his daughter was dropped off at school and the morning hustle faded into silence, Michael sat behind the wheel once again. This time, it wasn't for work or errands or obligation. He just needed to drive, not to any specific destination, just away from stillness. The road stretched ahead like it always did, unchanging and indifferent. But today, he noticed things more acutely. The shadows of trees flickering across the dashboard, the glint of sunlight on other cars, the drivers who glanced over and then away without thinking. He became aware of how easily the mind could wander in moments like this, but also how dangerous it could be when it wandered too far. He checked the rearview mirror, out of habit, and for a moment he didn't see cars. He saw himself, frozen in the same reflection he'd stared into the night before, hands still on the wheel, waiting. It was strange, he thought, how something so simple, just a look in the rear view, could carry so much. That small rectangle of glass had shown him who was behind him, but it had also become a kind of memory portal, a silent witness. Last night it had framed flashing lights, hard faces, suspicion. Now it framed only trees and sky and the back seat. But the memory clung to it. He could almost hear the officer's voice again, license and registration, and feel that quiet internal shift, the tightening of muscles, the careful breath, the mental cataloging of everything he must not do. It was like muscle memory, not from training at Quantico, but from life. He thought of the times he'd been stopped before, long before the badge, long before the bureau. Once when he was 20 and driving his mother's old Buick to a job interview, pulled over for a broken tail light that wasn't broken. Another time at 25, walking home from the gym, stopped and questioned because someone had reported a suspicious black man in a hoodie. And then more times than he could count, brief encounters, none violent, all charged. Each time he told himself it was isolated. Each time he hoped it wouldn't happen again. And each time it did. The badge was supposed to change that. And in some ways it had. But not last night. He pulled into the parking lot of Small Overlook just outside the city, a place he sometimes went when he needed quiet that didn't feel heavy. The view rolled out before him. Hills dotted with trees, the skyline distant and small, like it belonged to someone else. He shut off the engine and let the silence settle. No jazz, no traffic, just the sound of birds and wind and his own breath. He leaned back in the seat and looked up at the mirror again. This time, he didn't see anything but himself. No lights, no uniforms, just a man, alone in his thoughts, caught between exhaustion and resolve. And in that moment, he let himself ask the question he rarely allowed to surface. How many more times? How many more times would he have to explain, to prove, to swallow the instinct to shout? How many more moments would he replay in the quiet of his car, wondering what small choice might have led to a different outcome? How many more mornings like this, filled with stillness and memory, would he carry? He didn't know the answer. Maybe no one did. But he did know this. He wasn't powerless. He hadn't just endured the night before. He had exposed something. He had forced truth into the open, not with confrontation, but with presence, with integrity, with the quiet strength that came from knowing who he was. He adjusted the mirror slightly, just a fraction of an inch, and in doing so, caught a glimpse of the badge again, sitting on the passenger seat where he placed it earlier, its gold edge catching the light. He stared at it for a long moment, then reached over and picked it up. It felt heavier today, not physically, but symbolically, because now it wasn't just a marker of rank or responsibility. It was a reminder of contradiction, that even with it, he had still been vulnerable. And yet, it was also a reminder of the voice he carried, the platform he held, the people who might listen if he chose to speak. He placed the badge back in his jacket pocket, close to his heart where it had always been. Not for protection, not for proof, but because it belonged there, not as a shield, but as a charge, a calling. And then he started the car again, eased it back onto the road, and drove, not to outrun the memory, but to carry it forward. Because reflection wasn't the end. It was the beginning of clarity. And in the rearview mirror, he no longer saw fear. He saw purpose. That evening, after dinner was cleared and the dishes were tucked away in the warmth of the dishwasher's gentle hum, Michael found himself sitting on the living room couch, his fingers absently scrolling through the same few news headlines on his phone, not really reading any of them. The television was on, but muted, casting flickers of light across the walls as a nature documentary played in silence. His wife had already gone upstairs to finish grading papers, and the house had begun to settle into that late-hour hush, the kind that gently folded the day in on itself like a blanket. But the weight from the previous night had not folded away so easily. It lingered in the air like something unsaid, something waiting. A small shuffle of feet on the stairs drew his attention. His daughter padded into the room in her slippers, wearing one of her oversized pajama shirts, her stuffed bear tucked under one arm. She climbed up beside him without asking, curling up into the space between his arm and his side, the way she had done since she was small, back when her head barely reached his elbow. Now she was 9 and growing faster than he could prepare for, but some habits remained. She said nothing at first, just leaned into him, her presence soft and steady like the way she used to fall asleep in his lap on long car rides. After a few minutes of silence, she tilted her head up to look at him. "Daddy," she said quietly, "can I ask you something?" He looked down at her and nodded, setting his phone aside. "Of course. What's on your mind?" She hesitated, then pulled her legs up onto the couch so she could face him more directly. "Mom said something last night, after you came home. She didn't know I was listening, but she told Grandma on the phone that you got stopped by the police. She sounded worried. You didn't tell me about it." Michael felt a slow shift inside him, the kind that comes when your child asks a question you've rehearsed 1,000 times in your head, but still aren't quite ready to answer. He exhaled slowly and gave her a faint smile. "You heard that, huh?" She nodded. "Was it scary?" He paused, not because he didn't know the answer, but because he wanted to get it right. "Yes," he said softly. "It was." She studied his face, her eyes more thoughtful than afraid. "But why? You're not a bad guy. You help people. You're with the FBI. They're supposed to know that, right?" Her voice was full of the innocence that still believed the world ran on fairness and logic. And for a moment, Michael wished he could just tell her yes, that was exactly how it worked. That being good and doing right always protected you. But that wasn't the world he had grown up in. And it wasn't the world she was growing into. He reached for her hand and held it gently in his own. "Sometimes," he began carefully, "people make decisions based on what they think they see, not on who someone really is. And sometimes they're afraid of people who look like me, even if they don't have a reason to be." Her brow furrowed. "But that's not fair." He gave her hand a small squeeze. "No, sweetheart, it's not. But that's why we talk about it. That's why we have these conversations. Because being quiet about it doesn't fix anything." She was quiet for a moment, then leaned her head against his shoulder. "Did they hurt you?" He shook his head. "No, they didn't hurt me, but they scared me. And not just for myself. I was thinking about you, about how I want you to grow up safe, about how I want you to be treated kindly and fairly, no matter where you are or what you look like." Her grip tightened around his fingers. "I don't want you to be scared, Daddy. I want to fix it." The earnestness in her voice broke something in him and healed something else all at once. He kissed the top of her head and held her close. "You know how we start fixing it?" he asked. She looked up. by being brave enough to see it, to name it, to speak up when it happens, even when it's hard. She nodded slowly, her expression serious. Is that why you didn't yell at them? He smiled gently. Exactly, because yelling wouldn't have changed their minds. But showing them who I really was? That made them look at themselves. Sometimes the quietest strength is the loudest. They sat like that for a while longer, wrapped in shared silence that wasn't heavy, but meaningful. Eventually, her eyes began to flutter shut, and he carried her upstairs to bed, tucking her in with her bear nestled against her side. As he stood by her doorway, watching her drift into dreams, he realized something that surprised him. He didn't feel defeated. Not tonight, because in this small, powerful conversation, he had planted something, a seed of understanding, a foundation of truth. And maybe one day, when she faced her own challenges, she would remember this talk, remember his calm, remember the way he had turned fear into something useful. Back downstairs, the house once again still, Michael sat on the couch and stared at the badge resting on the coffee table. For so long, he'd thought of it as a tool, a symbol, a necessary buffer between him and the assumptions others might make. But tonight, after talking to his daughter, it felt like something more. A mirror, maybe, not just of who he was, but of the world he was trying to shape for her. One where her questions wouldn't be born out of worry, but curiosity. One where answers didn't have to come wrapped in warnings. One where justice wasn't something to carry in your pocket, but something that lived in every conversation you dare to have. The next morning, Michael arrived at the precinct earlier than expected. He had called the station the night before, not to file a complaint in the traditional sense, but to ask for a meeting. He didn't want to scream. He didn't want headlines. He wanted a conversation, one rooted in truth. He walked up the stone steps of the precinct with steady purpose, his badge tucked in his coat, but visible if needed. Not as a weapon, but as a reminder. A reminder that the lines people drew between citizen and authority, suspect and servant, weren't always where they should be. At the front desk, he gave his name, and within minutes he was led down a quiet hallway and into a room with large windows and blinds that had been pulled closed, as if the conversation about to happen needed to be shielded from too much light. Chief Ronald Bell stood when Michael entered, offering a handshake that was firm but measured, his eyes scanning Michael's face with the kind of practiced neutrality that came from decades in law enforcement. He gestured to the chair across from him. "Agent Lawson, I appreciate you coming in." Michael nodded and took the seat. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me on short notice." The chief sat as well, clasping his hands on the desk in front of him. The air in the room was quiet, not tense, but expectant. Like both men understood something real was about to be said, and neither wanted to be the first to flinch. I reviewed the stop. The chief began, body cam footage, radio logs, everything. I have to be honest, I expected to be angrier when I watched it. But what I felt more than anything was tired. Tired of the cycle, of knowing we're still here, still repeating this. Michael listened carefully, watching the chief's face, noting the slight sag at the corners of his eyes, the way his shoulders seemed to carry the burden of more than just brass and title. "I don't want this to be a witch hunt," Michael said plainly. "I didn't come here to demand firings or file lawsuits, but I also can't just let it go." The chief leaned back slightly, nodding. "Tell me what you want." Michael took a breath, steady and deep. "I want your officers to see what happened not as a mistake, but as a mirror. I want them to look into it. I want them to ask themselves the questions they never had to before. Why was I treated the way I was even after presenting credentials? Why was escalation the first instinct? Why did the sight of a black man behind the wheel of a clean car in a quiet neighborhood ring alarms louder than the words federal agent? I want them to be uncomfortable, because if they're not, nothing changes." The chief looked down at his desk for a long moment, fingers tapping gently against the wood. "You're right," he said finally. "Uncomfortable is where change begins." He sighed. One of the officers involved, he's young, smart, but impulsive. The other, veteran guy, good record, but he carries some old instincts, habits formed before this department started turning the corner. Neither of them came into the job with hate in their hearts. But bias doesn't need hate to do harm. Michael nodded slowly. "I know that. but knowing it doesn't erase the effect. That night, they didn't just pull me over. They pulled over every black man who ever sat behind the wheel and wondered if the badge in his pocket would matter more than the color of his skin. The chief leaned forward, elbows on the desk. "What do you suggest?" The door cracked open. Not wide, but enough. Michael answered without pause. "Let me speak to them. And not just them. Your whole department. Let me come in, not as an agent, but as a colleague. Let me tell them the story, not the headline, not the viral video version, but the human version. Let me ask them the questions I've asked myself. And let me help you build something better from the inside." The chief studied him for a moment, then offered a slow, measured nod. "You do that, even after what happened?" Michael's answer came quietly, especially because of what happened. The chief didn't speak for a long moment. What he did, his voice had softened. 20 years ago, this kind of conversation wouldn't have happened in this room. You would have been told to file your paperwork and let internal affairs handle it. And you probably would have walked out of here angrier than when you came in. But the world's changed. Not fast enough, and not everywhere. But today, this conversation is happening. And I won't let it stop here. He reached for a folder on the corner of the desk and slid it toward Michael. "Here's the internal review. You're welcome to it. And I'll make sure the invitation to speak is formal. I'll set it up. No red tape." Michael accepted the folder, but more than that, he accepted the weight of what came next. Because now it wasn't just about a badge or a stop or a single moment on a quiet street. It was about what could grow from it, what could be built in its shadow. He stood, extended his hand again, and this time the chief shook it with something that felt less like obligation and more like respect. As Michael left the room and stepped back into the light of the hallway, he felt it. Not relief, not closure, but momentum, the beginning of something earned. And as he walked through the precinct's front doors and back into the bright morning air, he knew the story wasn't over. It was just finally being heard. The room was quiet in that specific way that precedes something important, a hush not born of silence, but of anticipation. Rows of officers sat shoulder to shoulder in their neatly pressed uniforms, some with arms crossed, some with pens in hand, all waiting. The precinct's training auditorium, usually home to tactical briefings and procedural updates, now felt different, charged, unsettled, and expectant. At the front stood Michael, not in his FBI-issued blazer or with his badge clipped to his belt, but in a simple button-down shirt and slacks, the kind of clothes that removed rank and left only the man. No podium stood between him and the crowd. He wanted nothing to hide behind, just clarity, just truth. He paused before beginning, letting the silence stretch long enough to become real. Some eyes avoided his. Others watched closely, trying to decipher his intent before a word had even left his mouth. Then he took a single breath, not to steady himself, but to commit. "My name is Michael Lawson," he said, his voice calm, clear, unshaken, "and I work for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. But today, I'm not standing here as an agent. I'm standing here as a black man who got pulled over last week for no clear reason other than the way I looked behind the wheel of my own car." A few officers shifted in their seats. A cough echoed from the back of the room. Michael didn't flinch. He had lived too many versions of this moment in his mind not to be ready for discomfort. "I know what some of you might be thinking, that I'm here to accuse, that I'm here to lecture, but I'm not. I'm here because I want to understand, and I want to be understood, because what happened to me could have happened to any black man in America. But what makes it different is that I carry a badge, too, one that should have meant I was safe, but it didn't." He took a few steps forward, closing the space between him and the front row. "I know how this job works. I know the fear, the unpredictability, the need to make fast decisions. I know the pressure. But what I also know is this: your fear doesn't erase my humanity. Your suspicion doesn't rewrite my rights. And your badge doesn't protect you from the consequences of unchecked bias." A long pause followed, his eyes sweeping the room, looking not for reactions, but for recognition. "The night I was stopped," he continued, "I did everything right. Hands visible, voice calm, credentials ready. And still I saw it. The doubt in their eyes, the quiet hand near the holster, the moment they saw danger instead of dignity." The room remained still, the air taut with silent agreement or unspoken resistance. It was hard to tell. But Michael wasn't speaking to win anyone over. He was speaking to leave a mark. "Let me ask you something," he said, softer now. "If I had been your brother, your neighbor, your partner in this very precinct, would that stop have gone the same way? Would you have approached my window with the same caution, the same assumptions?" No one answered. That wasn't the point. The point was to ask. The point was to make them hear the question echo inside long after he was gone. He glanced at the far corner of the room, where the two officers who had pulled him over sat quietly, their faces unreadable. He didn't point them out. He didn't need to. "We talk a lot in law enforcement about duty," he said, "about courage. But real courage isn't just running toward danger. Real courage is looking in the mirror and admitting when we've failed. It's listening when someone tells you their truth, even when it makes you uncomfortable. Especially then." He stopped speaking for a moment, letting the silence expand like a breath held too long. Then, with deliberate care, he pulled his badge from his pocket and held it up. Not high, not with triumph, but with solemn clarity. "This badge is supposed to mean something," he said, his voice steady. "It's supposed to represent justice, fairness, integrity. But the night I was stopped, it didn't matter. Because before they saw the badge, they saw my skin. And that means we're failing somewhere. Not because every cop is racist, but because too many good ones are too quiet. Because culture doesn't change through policy. It changes through people. Through conversations like this. Through honest reckoning." A murmur rippled through the room. Not loud, but real. Eyes met his now. Not with defiance, but with something closer to awareness. Some officers leaned forward slightly. Some sat straighter. Others lowered their gaze, not in shame, but in thought. Michael knew the look. It was the look people wore when something had cracked open inside them, when a truth had landed somewhere deeper than defensiveness. "I'm not asking you to be perfect," he finished. "I'm asking you to be better, to be conscious, to lead not just with authority, but with empathy. Because the power you carry can either protect or destroy. And that choice lives in every single stop, every single decision, every single moment you put on that uniform." He lowered the badge and placed it gently on the edge of the table beside him. "This isn't just a job," he said, his voice now barely above a whisper. "It's a responsibility. Don't take it lightly." With that, he stepped back, nodded once to the chief at the rear of the room, and exited without fanfare. No applause followed. No standing ovation. Just silence. The kind that didn't come from discomfort, but from reflection. And sometimes, Michael knew, that was the sound of real change beginning. The days that followed passed quietly, not in the way that signaled forgetting, but in the way that meant something had landed and was still settling. The precinct carried a different air, an awareness not yet verbalized, but no longer avoidable. Michael didn't return immediately. He didn't need to. The words he had spoken at the front of that room hadn't vanished into the walls. They had lingered, taken root in silent nods and long stares at the floor, in officers who sat with their morning coffee a little quieter, who reviewed their body cam footage not out of obligation, but out of curiosity about their own instincts. The conversation had not ended with applause. It had begun with silence. And that silence had stayed, shifting things in small, necessary ways. Michael returned to his own office at the bureau and resumed his work with the same discipline that had always defined him, but something inside him had changed. Not shaken, centered. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like he was carrying two selves. He wasn't just the agent in the room or the black man in the room. He was both. And the burden of choosing which version of himself to present, depending on the company, had finally begun to lift. He still walked with the same posture, the same calm presence, but now there was a deeper stillness beneath it, a knowing that he had not only survived the encounter, but transformed it into something useful, something enduring. 1 week after the speech, he received an email from the precinct. It wasn't from the chief this time. It was from one of the officers who had been in the room, Officer Daniels. Young, sharp-jawed, and the same one who had kept his hand near his weapon during the stop. The message was short but deliberate. "Agent Lawson, if you're open to it, I'd like to buy you a cup of coffee. I've been thinking about what you said, and I realize there's a lot I haven't been willing to see. I'd appreciate the chance to talk, one-on-one. No uniforms, just two men figuring it out. Respectfully, Daniels. Michael read it twice. Then again, not because he was suspicious, but because the tone was real. And in this work, sincerity was rare currency. They met 2 days later at a small cafe not far from the precinct, a neutral place with worn tables and the aroma of cinnamon and roasted beans. Daniels arrived first, dressed in civilian clothes, jeans, flannel shirt, not a badge in sight. When Michael walked in, their eyes met immediately, and for the first time, there was no flicker of tension, no guardedness, only something resembling humility. They shook hands, sat down, and for a few moments, neither spoke. They just let the quiet fill the space, not out of awkwardness, but respect. Finally, Daniels broke it. "I owe you an apology," he said plainly. "Not because someone told me to say it, and not because of your badge, but because I saw fear where there wasn't any. I saw threat instead of presence. And that's on me." Michael didn't rush to respond. He let the words breathe. Then he nodded slowly. "I appreciate that. But more than that, I appreciate that you're here. Most people wouldn't be." Daniels gave a faint smile. "I didn't sleep well after your talk. Not because you called anyone out, but because I realized I never thought about how it feels from the other side of the window. I just assumed I was doing my job, right, if nobody got hurt. But that's not the whole job, is it?" Michael stirred his coffee, then looked at the younger man. "No, it's not. The job is about protection, not just procedure. It's about humanity, not just compliance. And when we forget that, even for a second, we lose something we can't get back. Not just trust, but the reason we signed up in the first place." They talked for over an hour, not as opponents, but as men meeting in the space between guilt and grace. Daniels asked questions, honest ones. Michael answered without condescension. They didn't solve everything, but they started something, and sometimes beginnings are more powerful than conclusions. As they stood to leave, Daniels offered his hand again, but this time, it wasn't just a gesture. It was a promise. "If you ever speak again," he said, "I'd like to be in the room. Not just to listen, but to stand with you." Michael met his gaze, saw not just understanding but resolve, and nodded. "Then let's make sure there's a next time." Outside, the air was crisp, the afternoon sun casting long shadows down the sidewalk. As Michael walked back to his car, he passed a mother and her young son holding hands, laughing about something small and simple. The boy looked up at Michael and smiled, and without thinking, Michael smiled back. It was the kind of moment he hadn't allowed himself to feel fully for a while. But now, something was different. The weight hadn't disappeared, but it had shifted. It was no longer just his to carry. Others were starting to lift it, too. That evening, back at home, he stood on the porch with his daughter, watching the sun disappear behind the trees. She looked up at him and asked, "Did the police say sorry?" He thought of Daniels, of a handshake, of the change that didn't announce itself, but showed up anyway. "One did," he said, "and sometimes that's how it starts." She nodded, then leaned against him. "I'm proud of you, Daddy." He smiled, placing his arm around her shoulders, and in that moment, the world felt just a little bit more possible. Not fixed, but moving. And in that movement, in that small shift towards something better, he felt a new kind of respect begin to take shape. Not the kind earned through titles or shields, but the kind that lives where truth is told and heard, where people choose to see each other, finally, as they are. And that, my friends, is where this powerful story comes to an end, but the conversation it opens is far from over. If this story moved you, made you think, or reminded you of something from your own life, I want to sincerely thank you for spending your time here with us today. Your presence means more than you know. If you found value in this video, please take a moment to give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that matters. More importantly, I'd love to hear from you. What did this story make you feel? Have you or someone you know ever experienced something similar? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts or your story. This is a space where your voice truly matters. Thank you again for watching, for listening, and for caring. Until next time, take care of yourself and one another.